Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of Elevate Your Craft, the podcast. I'm really happy to be here. And today, basically the main topic of discussion will be fine dining, wine, food, liquor, all the things that sort of go with it, and a bit about the business side too. But before I move on, I just thought it'd be a good idea to give everyone an idea of what Elevate Your Craft, the podcast is, and what I'm going for. So it all kind of started, or was born from my curiosity, really about anything. I've had some really good discussions with a lot of different people, with different skills on different areas of life, and I thought, you know what, the podcast would be a really great way to share those discussions with everyone, and hopefully you can learn something from it. So that's it in a nutshell. Today I have a great friend of mine, Mr. Matthew Landry, here with me. And before we kind of get into it, I'll just kind of ask him to give a bit of background on what he's doing, who he is, how he got into the business, and then we'll start it off from there. So hello, friend. Welcome. I'm very happy to have you here today.
I'm happy to be here.
I hope you are. Thank you.
It's great. I don't often get to Burlington, so.
No, very few do. Except for me, but that's okay. So yeah, if you could just tell everyone a bit about yourself, how you got into the industry, what you're currently doing, and if there's anything specific about fine dining that you loved from the beginning that kind of pushed you in that direction.
Yeah, so I am currently the general manager and I guess sommelier at Actinolite restaurant in Toronto. Like most people, I think, in our culture, I got into serving to pay my bills while I was doing other things. It's a pretty common trope, actors, musicians, writers, comedians. So I always did it, and it's pretty, you can find a way to make really easy money, and it's a lot better than working at like a Subway. So I sort of always did that, and I would say about maybe 2 years ago, it sort of transitioned away from doing it as something just to make money to something that I found a sort of creative passion in and wanted to pursue it as a career.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that transition, do you think it was more like, what made it serious? Was it, okay, like I have to actually care about this now? Or was it I have to learn a lot more? What was it that kind of defined that transition?
Well, I met someone. I started working at a place that actually took it very seriously. It's a restaurant called Yours Truly in Toronto, which actually is just closing down at the end of this month after 2.5 years. And it was a very ambitious restaurant. And I started working there as a server, just sort of part-time. And then I wanted to get into bartending just to get more shifts. And the bar manager at the time, a man named John, was a kind of a PhD student in philosophy, incredibly studious, smart person who knew more than anyone could ever want to know about cocktails, and sort of took me under his wing, and he was smart enough to kind of point out how much creativity and freedom and how much honesty there was in that level, in that style of work, in that type of work, that I think often in our society people kind of laugh at, oh, you're just a server. Mm-hmm. But when there's people who do it really, really well, it is sort of a magical thing to watch, and that was sort of who I learned it from, and I got really into spirits and cocktails through him, and then just sort of found my way and just fell into wine through happenstance. The person who did our wine left. They had no one to do it. They asked me to do it. I was terribly unqualified, so I've just been sort of on a race to get qualified, and I've pretty much like that ever since. Mm-hmm. And yeah.
So on a larger scale, what is fine dining to you? And it's a loaded question, but I know there's something for you about it that you really like.
Yeah, I guess there's different elements of fine dining. There's the really classic, the sort of ceremony of fine dining, where you think of that sort of snooty French waiter and white tablecloths and everyone's dressed up, and it's where you go on your mother's birthday, and it's like a big event. And then there's the idea of fine dining, and the idea of novel and interesting and exciting food in and of itself. Would disassociate that with the experience of spending a lot of money on it. The idea of eating well and food and wine and liquor factoring into your life as not just something to satiate yourself, or not just drinking to get drunk or eating to not be hungry, but as something you look forward to something to elevate your day, to to think about, and that gives you, and that sort of, you use that as a prism to look at your life through the kind of food and wine, and that's definitely that's what I look for in fine dining.
Yeah.
Obviously, not only I can't afford to eat in really, really expensive restaurants all the time. It can be a bit stuffy, but the idea that wine and food and liquor, that good wine and food and liquor are part of your everyday life was sort of revelatory.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you kind of go for more of a purpose instead of, like you said, to satiate yourself. You go looking for maybe something new, or like a different pairing or a different wine, something like that.
I mean, absolutely. I think some people want the same wine every day, and some people want the same beer every day, and some people want the same food every day. I'm not one of those people. So,
how do you think it's perceived by people that don't, regularly go or at all to fine dining establishments? Don't really know. They'll drink their Coors Light or their Smirnoff or whatever kind of, whenever they do. How do you think it's perceived by them? I would imagine really it's just a price tag, sort of an unnecessary expense.
I think some people, imagine most people don't get it. They don't look to food or wine to be enlightening or terribly exciting. It's something it's a special occasion sort of thing that they almost do out of sort of a routine or an expectation. It's your birthday, so you go to this nice restaurant and you spend more money than you want to on your alcohol and your food. But most days, you don't care. You'll just go to Moxie's or what have you. And I also think there's a certain, the outdated idea of the snootiness of it, of the elitism of it, which can exist in my industry. There can be a certain amount of elitism about food and wine that can be off-putting to the average person. I think of like people I grew up with, and but yeah, it's sort of, people kind of don't really understand it. Why would you spend $80 on a bottle of wine? I just got that bottle of wine for $10. They don't really understand that.
Well, it's something that's definitely new for me, and kind of being curious about it. I definitely appreciate it more because, my diet, it's not much to it. Pretty much just kind of the same foods over and over again, in a different
Food
type
is
of
fuel, I believe, is your tagline.
It's a different type of eating well.
Yeah.
But that's actually a good segue into kind of comparing the two types of restaurants, because you have, your standard ones like the Kelsey's and, even the Kegs, the Montanas. And it seems that they're kind of, the overall purpose of them is very, very different, and kind of outline that restaurant. And if you can kind of go into how fine dining establishments and their purpose, and what it is and how it compares to that. Because when I think of a standard restaurant, I kind of think, a lot about the environment, a lot of very tacky type of surrounding. The menu's huge. It's meant to appeal to a lot of different people, kids, families. There's no courses. I mean, technically there is, I guess, but you kind of have your appetizer menu and then your entrees, but that's pretty much it. And the staff, especially, really know nothing or very little about the food that they're serving. And I'm sure you can sort of enlighten us on how that differs in the fine dining. Because just from my perception as someone who doesn't frequent them, everything seems much more focused, including the menus. So they seem to change. I mean, I remember going to one with you. It wasn't yours. It was yours truly. And there were very few menu items, but everything was there for a purpose. All the ingredients in whatever course you chose were there for a specific reason, for a specific purpose. And especially the bartender, I don't remember his name.
That would have been John.
That would have been John.
The man himself.
And I remember, I think I got an old-fashioned, and there was a history of the beverage that came along with the drink, and it was written, but John gave me quite the lesson on the beverage, and that struck me just from a knowledge standpoint, that someone knows so much about what they're serving, and that was quite refreshing, as being someone who doesn't go to them much. So, if there's anything you could add to that, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, those places, the Shenanigans type of restaurant chain, they're not serving food. It's just a place. I mean, if I was just catching up with you and some high school buddies, great, go to those places. You're not, whatever, as long as your chicken's cooked properly, it doesn't matter what it really tastes like, and you're just enjoying your company or whatever. Or you're just a parent who doesn't want to cook tonight, and so you just want like a $6 butter pasta for your kid. And it's not the same. You're not going there for the food. You're going there to be with people in a social setting. So the restaurant is just a facilitator of a certain experience. I mean, you go to a Boston Pizza, you're not raving about how good the pizza is. You just want to sit with your buddy and drink some beer and watch a hockey game. Whereas fine dining restaurants or just even elevated casual dining restaurants, you want to experience a type of cuisine. You go there specifically for the food. Hopefully it's always more enjoyable when you go with people that you like. But the restaurant itself is why you go there. So I mean, to work in a place like that, I've been lucky that I've never had to work in a Kelsey's or a what have you, because those places are pretty soulless, and I pretty much guarantee most of those people are working as servers to pay for other. And whereas you go to a place with professional servers, they're people who sort of have a certain love or interest in the craft of hospitality, and whether it's a wine focused place or a cocktail focused place or whatever, it's a sort of it's like meeting a really interesting group of people and them welcoming you into their circle of like, all right, let me take you on a journey, and let me show you something you haven't seen before. Let me make you something you haven't tasted before. Let me tell you something about wine that you don't know. It's a novel experience, which is really exciting, and they're very specific things. They're very focused, and that they don't cast a wide net trying to get everyone. They just do what they do very well, and hopefully people come to it. And the most successful kind of fine dining restaurants of all places had a very, very specific focus, whether it be like Noma with kind of that new Nordic cuisine, or David Chang's Noodle Bar, or what have you. They have these very, they stand for this thing, and you get on board. And if you're open-minded, you love it, and some people hate it. Some people wouldn't do it, because some people want to control it, and some people want everything to taste the same, and they want a pasta Alfredo, and they want a steak, and they want a New York-style cheesecake, and that's how they want their 3 courses to go. But yeah.
I don't imagine you working at that type of place. This is sort of a conventional restaurant. I don't imagine you learn much at all. But I mean, like you said too, I don't imagine they're working there.
They're not trying to learn anything, right?
Exactly.
I mean, there's so much in this world that if in any industry, and especially for me, at least in the food and hospitality industry, there's so much to learn that if you want to learn it, you can really elevate yourself very quickly above 90% of the bartenders or the servers in your field. It doesn't take that long, because I think in North America, especially, the bar has been set so low what it means to be a bartender. I mean, that's why they use this terrible term mixologist. It's the worst term, and no real bartender would ever want to be called a mixologist. But that term came about to sort of classify, there's bartenders, like the skeezy guy who's going to take the woman home at the end of the night, and then there's a mixologist, someone who knows about drinks, who's interested, who has the history, is going to make you something different. And now it's a super convoluted term, but I can see why 10, 15 years ago, before the whole cocktail revolution happened in New York, why that term might be necessary. Because if you were very serious about your craft and you said you're a bartender, most people would think you're just a deadbeat. because just slinging cosmopolitans. But now, I mean, in the last 10 years or so, bartender's been something that now is suddenly very hip to be, and if you know your stuff, it's very cool. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And going to back...
Don't ever call a bartender a mixologist.
I won't, don't. So what do they like to be called? Bartenders?
Yeah, absolutely. Bartender,
Okay.
yeah. Well, they won't say anything, but they'll judge you inside their head.
Yes,
Yeah.
as they probably do already. But going back to what you said on, you kind of have your focus and you stick with it. And, if you're on board, great. If you're not, do you find that a lot of regulars come to this type of restaurant, or is it more just tourists or new people all the time?
I mean, it depends. A lot of fine dining places are obviously in a certain price category that a regular at those places doesn't necessarily mean a regular. You can't come every week. I mean, I've served people who can definitely afford to come every week, but most people can't. But they come back once every month or once every 2 months. In my restaurant, our menu is changing usually a dish or two at a time every couple of weeks. So in a 2-month span, you get a whole new menu. And people usually come back kind of as the menus are changing to try new dishes. But yeah, I mean, I think you get a regular type of person at those places. You get a nice review, and then you get the sort of bridge and tunnel crowd, if you let me use a certain elitism. But you get those kind of touristy people who are like, oh, I heard this restaurant's good. I don't know anything about it, but I heard it's good, so I'm going to go check it out. And they come in, and some of them like it, some didn't know what they're getting into and hate it, and they leave. But there's a type of person who always wants a new experience, and so you definitely get those type of customers, which is really the nicest kind of customers to get, people who are there to eat at your restaurant. They're not there to have dinner and then go to the club and do this stuff. It's not like a stop in their night. It's their night is based around your dinner, which is always the most humbling to serve, and it's super fun.
So would you say, kind of, because you mentioned previously on how you tell people about the wine, you tell people about the food, is that a byproduct of them being there? Do you think they kind of force that, or is teaching people or your customers planned and on purpose? Is that something you strive to do?
I mean, a sign of a quality restaurant, of a quality server, really is being able to read a table. Some people walk in, they know exactly what they want. This isn't their first rodeo, you know what, and they don't want to be bothered. And some people come in and they're just in a conversation with their date. They don't want to hear every ingredient on that plate and how it was cooked and stuff like that. And it takes about 10 seconds at a table to realize how much they want you as part of their dining experience. Some people, the second you look in their eyes, they tell you they want to be guided through this whole experience, and they're so excited, and it's just up to you to make it good or to fuck it up. And so it depends. I mean, some people walk in, they point to the most expensive bottle of wine, they order the biggest thing on the menu, and they take it from there, and your job's done. But some people really like to know about all the wines. So my restaurant, we do a tasting menu, 7 courses. People order wine pairings. We do the wine pairings at the table, so each course gets a different glass of wine. And generally, people who do that are interested in that journey, interested in being taught something about wine or tasting of pairings. And they ask, well, why did you pair it with that? And, oh, I've never heard of this wine, or where does this come from, et cetera, et cetera. And those people are always super fun to serve, and because I get to just you get to feel like you're not a conveyor belt of food. You're there to you're contributing to their experience, right?
Yeah. Well, that is very interesting in that you're able to adapt, really. The fact that you can do that. If someone wants to they want to be left alone, great. But if they do want the entire experience, you can give that to them.
I remember having dinner last year at a restaurant in Toronto called Canoe, which is it's owned by OMB, which is a big restaurant company, but it is for a restaurant that is owned by a giant kind of restaurant chain. It is exquisite food. It's super high ingredients. It's lovely. 53rd floor of the TD building, great view of Toronto. Very expensive, very traditional. And I went there with my girlfriend at the time, and we were sort of dressed up. It was a special occasion, and we kind of thought it was be this stuffy place, and we sat at a chef's table, and there was a single man beside us who clearly was very wealthy. He was in a nice suit, reading a newspaper as if this was his Wednesday night stop at this place. And, dropping $400 on dinner was not a big deal for him, which it would be for me. And what I noticed is that we had the same server, and the server with him was curt, to the point, quick in, quick out, made sure he had enough water, and that was it. And then with us, it was elbows on the bar, talking about anecdotes about his life, how he got into serving, this kind of food. Other servers would kind of walk over, talk to us. It was very casual because they could see us rubbernecking all the food going out the door, looking at all the dishes, talking. They knew that we wanted to be included, to talk to them about food, to pick their brains, because we were really interested in that sort of experience. And that's a good server, someone who knew we didn't want to be left alone. We didn't want to be treated curtly. We didn't want to just put food in front of us and walk away. We wanted to talk and ask questions and all that jazz, and that person didn't. And so he saw that, he recognized that, and without even saying anything, it kind of changed how he served. And you could tell, and he was a 40-year-old man and clearly been doing it for a long time and knew everything. Every question we asked, he knew the answer to, and he was just a professional, really.
Mm-hmm. Do you think a lot of people come from that? Because you mentioned before that you kind of just do it to make money while you're studying something else, or what type of education is required, or not necessarily required, but present, when you're a server or a bartender or, general manager of a restaurant? Or what is there, if any, education, or is it more education that's tailored to food and beverages specifically?
I mean, like most people our age, almost everyone I know has some sort of university or college education. Almost everyone. There are schools dedicated to culinary aspects. There's George Brown College has one. There's very famous ones throughout the world, in France, in New York, that will teach you everything you want to know about either I'm going to be a cook, or I'm going to be a sommelier, I'm going to be a front of house server. Teach you everything about the business. Those aren't necessary. I never did any kind of formal schooling in that sort of field. But I find that there's a certain level of education, and but it's not necessary. I think a certain curiosity is really what will make someone a good server, and being able to carry 3 plates without dropping stuff. So
being able to deal with people and.
Yeah, but it's funny. I mean, you sort of deal with all sorts of different personalities. I've seen people who are very, very charming in a restaurant setting, and then the second you go out for a beer, they're super awkward and quiet. And then I've seen people who, I was at dinner, I was recently on a trip to Europe, and I was at a very highly regarded restaurant called Dinner by Heston Blumenthal in London. It's considered one of the best restaurants in the world. And my server was one of the most awkward people I've ever come across in my life, who knew a lot. He was a sommelier, knew a lot about wine. He was I laughed when I talked to him because I found him so Rain Man-esque, but was not someone you'd call classically charming or funny, but he knew his job. And so, I mean, it's different. And he was about 23, wearing a full vest and suit, and talking about
awkward
Grand Cru Bordeaux, but then would shake and had his hands all. He was an odd guy, but I found him charming. I found him funny.
Focusing more on wine, how important is it to the whole experience, to the culture, to the restaurant itself? I imagine it's very important. But could you have, do you think, a successful fine dining establishment without wine?
Yeah, you could.
You'd probably just be missing out on.
You'd be missing out on what pays all your bills, because most restaurants, if they make any money at all, are making it from liquor and wine sales rather than food. You almost never make money on food. But you could. I guess you think like David Chang's Noodle Bar. That's sort of very humble, sort of like Asian street food. You don't need fine wines. I love his steam buns, but I don't necessarily need a Grand Cru, Pinot to go with it. So you can serve really high-end food without wine, but I couldn't really imagine. I can't think of any restaurant in the world that does it. I could be wrong. Yeah. But Noma has and a lot of in Scandinavia, the sort of natural wine movement. So they have very interesting, unique wines that wouldn't necessarily be considered classically the top ones. They don't have those sort of $5,000 bottles that you'd see in like Per Se or something like that in New York. They have these very kind of unadulterated, sulfur-free wines from the Loire that kind of smell like farts, and it's all very like natural and biodynamic, and it kind of goes with their idea of kind of local food and sort of getting in touch with nature, that sort of aspect. But
probably coincides with the message, or
it goes with their brand.
Yeah, it goes with their brand.
That's something I in Scandinavia. I mean, I love natural wines; they're very interesting. But after like a 9-course tasting menu of like a bunch of wines that don't taste like wines, it gets a bit old. But.
So natural wines. Wouldn't wine be natural anyway? What is that distinction?
Well, I mean, the idea of natural wine is that, for 60 years, you get these huge producers, and even medium-level producers, they're just spraying stuff with pesticides and filtering wines, and eventually everything's sort of converging on this, like, all Cabernets taste like this, and all Pinots taste like this, and it's all very safe and clean, and there's never really any sense of, there's a term called terroir, especially in French wine, the idea of a taste of place, that a wine made from grapes grown on this hill tastes distinctly different than grapes grown on that hill, and you have to the less you interfere with how these wines grow, the more they're going to represent the distinctions between the soils, and we're definitely getting into, it's moving back towards that of non-interventionist winemaking, and then there's full-on extreme biodynamic, all-natural, sulfur-free wines that taste unlike anything you could possibly imagine, be it good or bad. But that's a whole movement in the south of France, and really in Loire, and then in Italy. It's a really movement that's gaining a lot of traction in the wine world, and it has its pluses and minuses.
So in this area, how much of a presence do you see of Niagara wines?
I mean, in natural wines, not as much. The only people I could think of who are really, really into natural wines would be people like Pro Morissette, who's a really talented winemaker out of, I guess, Jordan, I think he was from. And then Stratus is almost biodynamic. Southbrook, I think, is completely organic and biodynamic. But if we're just talking strictly in terms of that, but
generally the Niagara wines, natural or not, how much of a presence do you see? Are they regarded as highly as other wines, internationally, or I
mean, internationally, no, not really. Internationally, Ontario wines are sort of non-existent. Norman Hardy out of Prince Edward County got some good press a few years back in Wine Spectator, and he's been, like, some restaurants in New York have had them on had him on their wine lists, so he's maybe an exception, but there's no truly internationally highly regarded Ontario winemakers, I don't think. Ontario makes some really lovely wines. They also make some very terrible wines. Ontario and Canada have never really kind of grasped onto a certain grape to be their flagship grape, the way that you think of Australian Shiraz, or you think of New Zealand Sauv Blanc, or South African Pinotage, sort of, maybe 10 years ago, or Argentinian Malbec, or Chilean Carmenere. These countries, these New World countries, all sort of have their grapes that they're known for. Canada doesn't really have that. Haven't really settled on a grape. I don't know. That's a good thing and a bad thing, so you don't get pigeonholed, because Canada, especially in Ontario, you can go Cab Franc really well, you can grow Riesling, you can grow Chardonnay.
So you think that's because they're trying to be diverse, or they're just the quality level hasn't reached a point where there hasn't.
I don't think there's been a consensus on what grape we grow best, and because we grow so many moderately to good. But there really is fantastic Ontario wines, like I said, Pro Morissette, or out of Prince Edward County, Norman Hardy, Hinterland, which is prominently sparkling, Clausen Chase, Long Dog. But these are kind of generally, you're going to get them in Montreal and you're going to get them in Toronto and not that many places else.
So you'll probably find an Ontario wine in the majority of
I would assume most restaurants in Toronto would have some Ontario selections. Some do exclusively Ontario selections, something like Farmhouse Tavern, which is more of a casual neighborhood restaurant, very popular, does all on VQA wines, and it's fine. There's some nice selections there.
Yeah. When it comes to red, white, the different types of wines, do you, specifically for your situation and maybe in general, is there a lot of kind of distinction between reds and whites? Is it kind of mandatory to have both? Would you promote one over the other, or does it all depend on the food?
You're not drinking your white wine, by the way.
Oh, well, I will. Don't worry.
Okay. I mean, it depends on the food, really. It's wine pairing. Before I got into wine pairing is one of those things. I think a lot of people, you sort of roll your eyes. No, if you like this wine, that's what you drink, regardless of what you're eating. There could be nothing further from the truth from that. Pairing wine and food, when done well, makes both the wine and the food better. In a way that is almost, sometimes when you hit it out of the park, it's remarkable. It gives you a certain excitement. And so with our food, my restaurant tends to be very light, very vegetable focused, not a lot of red meat, not a lot of sauces. So we tend to go white more than red. Obviously that changes with the season. More reds now that we're getting a little bit colder, but white, most wine pairings would be white heavy just because of its versatility, its acidity. I mean, red wine is lovely, and it's probably what I would drink if I wasn't eating food. But wine is definitely meant to be drank with food.
Yeah,
for sure. I think nothing ruins a good wine like not having food.
I guess so. You get the best of both worlds. So, in pairing specifically, kind of in general, that made no sense. Specifically for you, you kind of gave us some insight, but in general, are there any sort of rules or kind of things to follow when it comes to pairing food with wine? I mean, I wouldn't have.
Sure. Yeah, there's very general rules. I think that most people know, with like white wine with fish or red wine with a steak. Those are fine rules. They're well known for a reason. I've definitely reversed those on occasion, and it makes sense depending on the sauce. A couple of rules just off the top of my head. If your food is sweet, say having dessert, the wine you're drinking must be as sweet or sweeter than the food you're having, or it'll make the wine taste weird. So if you're eating ice cream and you had a dry oaked Chardonnay, it will make your Chardonnay taste terrible. Whereas if you had a nice dessert wine, like a Recioto, or if you're having a Sauterne or something like that, it'll taste nice. Wine always has to be as sweet, if not sweeter, than what you're having.
So that's where ice wine comes in?
Yeah, ice wine is, ice wines can be lovely.
Mm-hmm.
So you always want to match your body. If you have, if matching the body of wine, if it's a very heavy dish, you're probably going to want a little bit of fuller wine. Otherwise, it kind of gets lost. But and then there's classic pairings, like muscadet and oysters. So if you're having kind of salty seafood, you want something really acidic and zippy. Or with spicy Asian food, something a little bit sweeter, because the sweet wine, a touch of sweetness will offset the spiciness of it. Or if something's very, very salty, a little bit of sweetness will go well with it. Those are kind of classic combinations. Or if you're having asparagus, Gruner Veltliner, for some reason they just go well together. It's one of the few wines that go well with asparagus.
Just one of those trial and error things that's kind of been.
Or like dark chocolate, you got a Recioto, milk chocolate. Don't drink any wine.
Yeah,
It'd be terrible. It'd be terrible.
How do you choose the wine specifically? For
trial and error. That's a great thing. If you're, not everyone has this. Serious restaurants that take food and wine seriously, the chef will put up all the dishes, and the sommelier, the manager, will put up a bunch of wines, and you just taste them all. And obviously you have in your head what wines could theoretically work, and you line them up, and you open them all, and you taste them. And it's obviously it's expensive. You pour a little wine down the drain or down your throat, and you don't make your money back on. But it's a very, very important process of pairing wine and food, that because you never know off the top of your head, rosé is versatile, I'll pair that, I'm sure it'll work. And then you didn't know this had this sort of aspect to this dish that maybe something else would go better, that ruins the taste of the rosé or what have you. You never really know until you do it. Mm-hmm. And so before any dish is served to a customer, it's served to the staff and served to myself, and we open wines and we taste them all, and we find what works best.
So the chef has quite the involvement in the choosing,
yeah,
or
no? I mean, probably not. I mean, not in every restaurant. In my restaurant, the chef puts up the food, and I always give it to him. Obviously, the final judgment is mine, but he likes to taste the wines. Justin, it doesn't. He wouldn't. He would say he doesn't know a lot about wine, but he definitely likes to drink it, and he has an amazing palate, much better than mine, just from years of cooking. So when he finds stuff in a certain taste or a certain subtle complexity to a wine that maybe I didn't get, then I reconsider how it might work into a pairing. And so it's great. So I always like sharing it with him and all the cooks, and then they're always sharing new dishes they're working on, and they usually test dishes weeks out before they go on the menu. So I'm usually thinking about wine in the weeks coming up, how the menu's going to change, and it's just all about preparation.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually glad you mentioned the palate, because obviously the chef, a good one, I imagine, has a great palate. How important is it for everyone else? I mean, do you yourself have a...
I have a terrible palate. I mean, a palate is something that is part nature, but probably more learned. I was not blessed to grow up in a house that exalted food and wine, so I came from a sort of instant mashed potatoes sort of house, which I, on the record, still love instant mashed potatoes, but so this is all, I'm still always playing, I always feel like I'm playing catch up when it comes to this sort of stuff, but yeah, some people are just better at it than others. My ability to pair comes more from my theoretical knowledge of it than necessarily my blind tasting of it.
At least at this point.
At this point, 10 years down the road, I'm sure I will have tasted enough food and enough drinks to have a lot more of an astute palate. But I'm still sort of scraping off years of Coke Zero from my tongue. So,
and the Sunday chicken wings, homemade chicken wings.
Yeah, that was good. But
moving off of wine, liquor.
Yeah.
Equally, or not as equally important, but do you think it is? Is it as important or given as much significance as wine in your restaurant, or we think the majority of restaurants just in general?
I think it's getting there. It's historically has not been. When you think of the sort of history of cocktails, that sort of like pre-prohibition era was amazing for cocktails, and then the Prohibition era, or the Art Deco era, whatever you want to call it, when all the great bartenders went to Europe and were inventing all those drinks now, they're inventing them all. And then you had tiki drinks, which is an amazing culture. Not everyone loves, I love. But it sort of all dropped off after kind of in the 60s, when people decided to smoke a lot more pot than drink alcohol. Cocktails sort of slowly fell off, and then you think of the 80s, just like sugary garbage, and you think of that like kind of Galliano type liqueur or flavored vodkas, probably more 90s, but so cocktails were definitely had a bad rep for a long time. It really wasn't only until the last maybe 15 years where cocktails started becoming exalted again, especially in New York, where it all sort of started with places like Milk and Honey, and I'm going to blank on all the names now, but and now you think of restaurants like Employees Only, and you think of in London Nightjar and White Lion, these places that are just crazy next level type drinks, and it's getting that way.
What Or are those more kind of little cocktail bars?
Yeah.
Would you say?
That's a very, when you think of those old school like steakhouses, when you think of like a bunch of old men smoking cigarettes, someone playing piano in a corner, 70-ounce Côte de Boeuf that one man is eating to himself. You think of like brown spirits and like Manhattans or dirty gin martinis, that very classic aspect of it. And that was always something you kind of had before dinner, and then maybe you had some scotch after dinner. And that's sort of part of that experience that maybe you got lost a little bit with the death of those sort of fine classic staid restaurants. But as a compendium to eating, it's sort of, cocktails have sort of come about, they've sort of matured outside of food, and only now are you sort of marrying them back together in terms of cocktails being part of a fine dining experience. They're sort of separate for a while. There was like, you eat wine, you drink wine with your dinner, and then there's a night where you go get high-end cocktails. And trying to marry those two together is, that happens in some places. It happened at Yours Truly. I think Yours Truly for a long time was the best bar in a restaurant in the city. But it's not, it's different because people can't drink Manhattans with every course, or we have to carry them out in a stretcher. So it's a different type of pairing. But I mean, I've heard of cocktail pairings, like people do low alcohol cocktails, sherry-based cocktails, vermouth-based cocktails for dinners. But that's probably an exception more than the rule.
So it's more kind of reserved for after or pre or post.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. I mean,
part of the...
to me as a manager, and the perfect diner comes in. They have a cocktail to start. They have the menu with the wine pairings, and they have some sort of drink after dinner. That to me is like, we've shown you everything we can do. We've shown you the cocktails that we make. We've shown you the wine that we've paired, the food that we've cooked, and then some sort of like nice after dinner, something to help you digest it. Call you a cab, put you on your way. That's the full experience. Not everyone does it that way, which is totally fine, which is whatever they want. But to me, that's how I like to go out. I usually have a drink before I start. I have some sort of wine with my food, and then I'll have something to drink afterwards. It's a very kind of classic kind of routine, but it's how I would like to go out and eat. And so I think cocktails have a very important part. There's nothing worse than having a really, really crappy, watery cocktail. And unfortunately, it's not something that everyone has a lot of skill in. And unfortunately, too many people think they have a skill in it that don't.
Yeah, it's definitely something I noticed, again, going back to that time at Yours Truly, was the cocktails. Now, would you say a lot of it's based on, you mentioned the Prohibition era and history, are a lot of these cocktails based off of historical recipes? Are there any new or modern types of cocktails? Yeah. Or I guess, do you try for that historical significance?
It depends what kind of cocktail you want to do.
Yeah.
I think especially in restaurants, it's sometimes nice to stick a little bit more conservatively with kind of tried and tested cocktails. That's not to say there's no room for adventurousness, but I think make me a really perfect Manhattan, or make me a really perfect Manhattan, and then we'll go from there. Let's sort of learn to walk before we run, sort of deal. And if you can't make a really nice Negroni, or a really nice Manhattan, or a really kind of fun, light daiquiri, you have no business making me a 16-ingredient infused monstrosity, which unfortunately some people sort of jump to before they've sort of mastered the basics.
Yeah.
It's like sort of like learning how to write without learning grammar. So there's different types of, there are very like classic cocktail bars where you go and then you get very sort of traditional drinks, perfectly made with high quality ingredients, and those are lovely, and that's probably what I prefer. And then there is people who sort of take that sort of adventurousness to cocktails the way that chefs do with food, that sort of gastronomy, molecular gastronomy, and sort of applying it to drinks the way like a bar like Bar Chef in Toronto does, where you pay $50 for a Manhattan and there's smoke and all sorts of crazy stuff. Wow. And your drinks are frozen and they're melting, and they're pouring stuff on, and there's flowers everywhere, and that's really interesting, and that's very adventurous, and has its place.
A bit of showmanship there.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was in London recently, the most impressive place I went to was definitely White Lion, which was so there's an event called Tales of the Cocktail once a year in New Orleans, and it's a big brouhaha for bartenders, more or less, and they have a big award show. And White Lion won Best New Cocktail Bar in the world for 2013. Their big thing is they don't use any citrus or any ice, and they don't use any brands, so they make all their own alcohol.
Wow.
And everything is made, pre-made and bottled and kept in a fridge, chilled. And then when you order it, they just open stuff up, pour it into a glass. And I tasted stuff I've never tasted before in my life. And it really is next level without being crazy and pretentious, because they're just two kind of English guys. Actually, I think he maybe is Australian. Just two nice guys just hanging out, and like just happened to be pouring really weird. Like I had a Sazerac. They use whale phlegm as a binding agent. Yeah. Apparently it's used in like high-end perfumes. But
that's not surprising.
Yeah, so like next level, like they take out a glass, they paint it with some sort of syrup, they pour some liquid into it, they serve it to you. It's a totally different type of cocktail making. It's not something I've ever done before. It's not something I really have an interest in doing, but it was amazing to watch. The drinks were actually very delicious, well balanced, interesting, unique. And then they still had that old school sense of hospitality where your water glass was always filled up and they're asking you about your day, which is the best of both worlds, really, because bartenders have two jobs. They have to make you a drink, but then they also spend the entire night standing 3 feet from your face. Mm-hmm. And you're sitting there, and that sort of classic idea is the bartender having a conversation with you, and they could do both, which is really nice and refreshing.
Yeah. And so they're kind of the innovators. So
yeah, that's about as far out as cocktail bars can get when you're not using any citrus or any ice.
Well, that's probably more surprising to me that they're not using citrus than the ice.
Yeah. No, they that's it's pretty impressive to watch.
Yeah. When it comes to the liquors, what are kind of the staples? Is there any sort of liquor that you think every single bar should have? So I think you mentioned this previously, where it's like, if this certain drink was made with a different type of, rum or a different type of the same alcohol, it would not work. Sure.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just pouring myself some more wine.
Right.
Yeah. So staples. I mean, there's the major spirits. You think whiskey, rum, gin.
And you could even include brands here, too. I mean, that's where I was sort of driving at.
Sure.
If it wasn't made with this brand, it just wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are brands I really like, and there's definitely a huge variation between different brands. It just comes down to taste.
Yeah,
I mean,
preference.
Like certain old Scotch cocktails, generally if they're asking for Scotch, they're asking for either a blended Scotch or something like a Macallan, some sort of slightly neutral Scotch. Not neutral, but they're not asking for Lagavulin or Lafroig. So if you make a Bobby Burns with Lafroig, it's going to taste awful.
Why is that?
Well, Lafroig is just it's an Islay Scotch. It's very, very, very peaty, distinctly peaty.
Yeah, campfire-y?
Yeah.
Okay.
So generally, I mean, I'm sure you can make cocktails with them, but generally, if you're having an ounce and a half or 2 ounces of Lafroig, you're probably having it by itself because it's so distinctive. And most cocktails would cost $40 if you're using Lagavulin in them. But yeah, no, I mean, I think bourbon, unfortunately, like Canadian whiskey is generally pretty shitty. Aside from a few examples, maybe like some 40 Creeks bottlings are okay. But generally it's pretty watery and a bit sharp. And
so more for those, I don't know if you even mix them.
Well, like if I was having
drinkers,
if I was at someone of my friend's stag and dough, I would have a Canadian Club and ginger ale. That's fine. That's what that's for, really.
Mm-hmm.
But if I was making a whiskey sour, I'm not going to use 2 ounces of Canadian Club. That would taste awful. I would use 2 ounces of either a bourbon or a American rye.
Yeah.
Depending on what I want to do with it, but. Yeah, it depends. I mean, it depends what you want. There's different types of. There's so many I mean,
there's so many types.
Daiquiris, I would use a white rum generally because it makes it a little bit lighter, but some people use darker rums. You could use agricole rums. It makes it sort of like, tastes like gasoline a bit. It's nice.
Mm-hmm.
But
a lot, it's, I guess, personal preference and what the bar or
I mean, if I
do.
came into a restaurant and they didn't have agricole rum, I wouldn't shake my head and be like, what kind of place is this? It's a pretty niche drink.
Mm-hmm.
But if I walked into a restaurant and they didn't have a bourbon, that would be weird to me. That would be weird that they didn't have a bourbon, even like a Maker's Mark or just something, or Wild Turkey or something very basic, even if they're not a cocktail bar.
Yeah.
So if you were starting a restaurant or a bar or whatever and you didn't have a bourbon or a gin or a rum, it would be odd.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So would you say, I think you kind of touched on this, but as far as a restaurant goes, the bar is not necessarily the most important part of it? Or are they trying to be equally kind of, you can go there for a cocktail or you can come for both?
It depends. I mean, you want to be as good at everything you do as possible. Mm-hmm. But I think most places would go, if you went out and had a really, really nice dinner somewhere and your drink was okay, it's not a huge deal. But if you went to a restaurant, had a really, really good cocktail, and your food was mediocre, you wouldn't go back.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it depends what you want to do. I mean, it's. Mm-hmm. I tried to make our cocktail program interesting. I want everything to serve a purpose. I want it to be fun, and I want people to be able to pop in and just have a drink rather than sit down and have a $150 tasting menu. But eventually it's like I only have so much time in the day, so I can't get
money.
You have to balance stuff
and going further on that, where you kind of said, one aspect of the restaurant's mediocre and the other's great. When it comes to people critiquing the restaurant and reviews, and when it comes down to it, do you think that's what a lot of restaurants are striving for, is just a great review? Like, do you think that's what you really need to make it?
You do. I mean, you absolutely do. So my restaurant before I was ever there started as a very casual neighborhood bistro that made I ate there once before I ever worked there. It was perfectly edible food with a nice room, and I sort of left and was like, I'd never think about that place again. And about a year ago, chef decided that he was going to be more adventurous with his food, and he was only going to do a tasting menu, and he was going to really kind of up his game, and shook things up. And for a long time, everyone left. All the people who wanted to come and spend $40, $50 on dinner were all saying, I'm not going to spend that much money on dinner. I'm not going to come back anymore. And when I started working there, I never worked in a restaurant so slow. We used to do nights where we did no one. No one came into the restaurant, which as a server is terrifying and makes you sad. Like you think you have a nice product and you put so much effort into it, and no one shows up to eat it. And slowly we'd have customers come in, and I'd have a night where I had one table, and they would love it, and they couldn't understand why it was empty. And we're going along, and then we got a really nice review in the Globe and Mail by Chris Noel Smith, and then, like I said, it exploded. One Wednesday I served 2 tables, then the review came out. The next Wednesday I had a full restaurant. It happened that fast, and for 4 months we were booked solid every night, pretty much. And so he that review changed everything, and not only does it validate what you do creatively and it makes you feel good, it on a very business level pays for itself. It pays for the restaurant, right? I mean, there's only so many weeks where you can lose money before eventually you have to I got to change something. And there were definitely months went by where he was definitely losing money at that restaurant, and so to have that review come out was what you can't downplay how huge that was. And any new restaurant coming out, Toronto is one thing. Like a place like New York, like a Times review would make or break a restaurant, and so critics were almost like gods back then. And if you gained a star, lost a star, it was was a huge deal.
And I don't imagine they make their presence known.
No,
but
no,
I mean,
they're very...
after they've reviewed the restaurant, do you make an effort to reach out to them again, or do you maintain contact? Like, does that
that's above
explosion kind of taper off after a while, or you kind of have to, okay, let's hope there's another review out there that
yeah, if anyone wants to come into Actinolite, we can do another review. No, it's we don't. You never reviewers. You don't invite them in. I mean, unless it's some sort of like kind of shady pay to play sort of scenario. But you don't do that kind of stuff. Reviewers mostly are anonymous. They don't tell you when they're coming in. And
no, that basically ruined.
Yeah, because then you send them a bunch of free
Wouldn't
food.
Wouldn't be a true
and
representation.
But no. Yeah, and it has a shelf life, a very quick shelf life, and so you always have to keep that perpetual kind of publicity machine going and reaching out to hotels and doing events, and because there's only so many times that sort of review we got in May is going to pay off, and you already see the summer slows down, and then there's only so many birthdays and special occasions for people to come spend as much money as they do at my restaurant.
Is a lot of the, whether it's the food and, we've kind of discussed the wines, and is a lot of it sourced locally? Like, you mentioned the events, is there a lot of community sort of involvement with the restaurant? Is the food sourced locally? Is that a point of pride? Is that something you advertise?
Sure. A lot of, I would say, I don't know exactly, I would say about maybe 80% of our food is from either Ontario or Quebec. Obviously, we've served things like octopus and stuff that hopefully you're not getting out of Lake Ontario. But it's all about farmers, really. I mean, in the spring, it was a lot of foraging. Chef and the cooks would go out on their days off, or they'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and drive an hour and a half out of the city to go find watercress or mustard greens or whatever grows wild, and they would bring it back in, and that was one aspect. Another stuff is having farmers growing like heritage seeds for you, or overwintered greens, or raising the animals that you use. Having those sort of connections, and either buying them directly from the farmer, which we've done, or going to something like the Dufferin Grove Food Market, or the one up on St. Clair, I forget what it's called, Witchwood Farms Saturday morning market. It's dealing individually with farmers is a huge point of pride for our restaurant, and I think a lot of restaurants. When you think of like a place like Kelsey's, like the reason your server doesn't know much about food is because the person cooking it probably doesn't know much of the food. It probably comes from a Cisco truck, and that chicken is probably a composite of several chickens all mashed together from some sort of weird sort of Frankensteinian little fucking laboratory. Yeah. I mean, it's the same. It's awful. It's the chicken breast you buy in the crappy Metro. It's terrible product, and being able to recognize the difference between that kind of crappy product and really high end product is not everyone's palate. A lot of people can't even tell the difference, unfortunately, because they're so used to eating one type of food. Like right now, we make all our own cheese in house, and a lot of people can't tell. I mean, if I blind tasted, like I said, I don't have a great palate. I might not even be able to tell, but the amount of effort and time and money that went into that cheese is extraordinary, and it's those little details that hopefully the right people and reviewers and all those people notice, and we've been lucky that the right people have noticed so far, and they get it.
Well, I think it'd almost be their job to notice.
Yeah, it's their job.
And if they didn't,
they shouldn't be doing that job.
Exactly.
That's why I'm not a food reviewer.
You just facilitate it. And give it to people.
Absolutely. And tell them a little something about some weird esoteric wine.
Do you kind of do everything at your current posting?
I have to. Yeah.
So you still serve and.
Yeah. It's a really small. It's a 32-seat restaurant in like some non-neighborhood and north of Bloor in Toronto. It's you don't really. I have to do all the ordering. I have to do for food, not for food. Sorry, for wine and for liquor. I have to serve, I have to bartend, I have to scrub toilets, I have to clean up, I have to sweep, I have to do all that stuff, and I mean, I'm not the only person who works there. I shouldn't.
You're doing everything.
I'm doing every single thing. I'm doing the eating, but yeah, there's no role too small for me, and hopefully most places a good manager would be like that, or a good sommelier. There's no job too small, no. But
well, it keeps you engaged too. Keeps you learning. That way you don't
Yeah.
kind of lose out in one area and
for sure
get rusty.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. It's it's got its pluses and its minuses. There's times when I'm like, man, I really just want to focus on wine today, but I'm like, no, I gotta go to the liquor store and buy some beer, and then I gotta come back, and then I gotta make simple syrup, or I gotta do this, and it bogs you down, but it's part of the job.
And beer. I'm glad you mentioned that too, because we've talked about wine, cocktails. Does beer play a big role?
It can. There are restaurants where it does. Like there are
kind of the local breweries.
Yeah, or when you think of like a place like Bar Isabel, which is a huge, just like a money factory. That place. It's an amazing place. I recommend anyone in Toronto to go there for drinks and food, and they have an amazing beer program. It's all very niche, sour beers. Lots of foreign stuff, lots of stuff from Quebec. They work a lot with the Barvolo guys, doing cask stuff, and their knowledge of beer is way beyond mine. But it can. There are restaurants with definitely a beer focus, and local breweries, and then kind of craft beer, and it's definitely a huge market. I mean, craft beer is expanding some kind of goofy amount, like a large amount every year. Craft beer sales and conserving kind of traditional beer sales are actually declining throughout North America. So it's definitely a huge trend. And I've seen people pair beer with food before in a wine pairing. There's a course where a beer is paired.
Oh yeah, you mean with like the appetizer or
whatever? Like what I've seen, the 7-course tasting menus, and one of the course pairings was a beer. And,
oh, okay.
Yeah, and it can. I mean, it can work. Beer can pair very well with certain things. Yeah, we generally focus on just sort of Ontario and Quebec beers. Not a huge focus in our restaurant. I just bring in what I want to taste, and when it's done, and I get something else. That's actually how I run my wine program too. Actually,
yeah.
I'm lucky that way because I'd say 70% of the people who come in do wine pairings. They're not choosing what wine they want to have, they're choosing the wine pairing. So whatever I have on hand and I can pair with food, I can serve them. So if you think of a traditional restaurant, you need California Chardonnay, you need Australian Shiraz, and you need Barolo, and you need all those big wines that people recognize. And
because they might request it.
Yeah, because because they're going to pick off a list, and they're like, oh, well, I like Argentinian Malbec, I'm going to get this glass of Argentinian Malbec. We don't really do that, so I can bring in whatever I'm interested in. And generally, I'll bring in a wine, and I might love it, and we run it out. I've had it, it worked, I'm going to try something else. That's generally how I choose to run my wine program, just to keep myself interested, no matter how much. I mean, I've had Norman Hardy's products in my restaurants for a long time, and I love them. But at the end of the day, it's like, I'm going to try a different Pinot Noir from Prince Edward County because I know Norm is great. He's always great, but I want to try something else. So
you can always bring it back.
I can always bring it back too, right? So
yeah. So how does that work? You mean they're choosing a pairing? So they're not. You're specifying which wine it is, or are you just saying?
Well, you can come in and get our menu, and you can either have a bottle of wine that you choose yourself.
Okay.
Or you can have a glass of wine, which we offer different glasses. Or you can choose the wine pairing, which is a set price, different wine with each course. And they don't choose which wines get paired with each course. I choose them.
I see. So are they picking the meal, and then you say, okay, I want, like, you pair the wine for me, or you have complete control?
Well, the good thing, like our menu, there's 2 choices. We have a 4-course and a 7-course menu. That's it. If you say I'll have 4 courses or I'll have 7, you don't pick what you have, right? Another option to that, you can say I want the wine pairing, which is another fixed price, and you say I want the wine pairing. So each course I've decided on a wine that goes with it.
Oh, okay.
So they get all those wines with all those courses. So the course comes out, I come over with the wine, I tell them about the wine, pour it in,
And that's,
they drink it.
I would think that's kind of the time where you're educating them more
Yeah, absolutely.
on why you've chosen the wine.
So I walk over and I'm like, hello, Mr. Kasimovic, this is the Radicchio, it's from the Marche region of eastern Italy. Known for high alcohol, high acidity, kind of like a little bit of nuttiness to it, very dry, blah, blah, blah. This is why I paired it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that's fun, and some people are really into it. Oh, Radicchio, never heard of that. I thought that was a bitter green. No, that's Radicchio.
As I did. Yeah.
Yeah, so that sort of thing. And some people are really interested in that sort of aspect, and it's great. And some people just want a bottle of Cab Sauv, and that's fine too.
And that's done. Hey, you mentioned earlier too that you recently traveled, and you kind of mentioned where. But were there any striking differences among the restaurants you visited, in the wines, in the food, and how they all interacted? Did you learn anything from those places? How much of a difference would you say?
Where I was traveling, the places I was eating at were higher end by design. I always, when I go on vacation, I usually base it around food that I want to try or restaurants I've heard about. I spent some time in Copenhagen with a lot of restaurants that I had heard about from my chef, who said, I ate here. It was really inspiring to what I'm doing now. You should go check it out. So there were always a lot of similarities to where I was eating overseas and to what my restaurant personally does. So in terms of differences, they have better wines over there because it's not all controlled by the government, which is nice. I found that some of the more, obviously these higher end places have very high levels of service, as you'd expect, paying that sort of price anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But
what kind of prices?
I've spent almost $1,000 on dinner for myself and a friend in one place.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's probably very reasonable. I went to a restaurant called Amos in Copenhagen, really well. Matt Orlando is his name. He used to be the sous chef at Noma, and I had a 9-course lunch with wine pairings, and it ended up being, after conversion, it was about $220 or $30 or something, which is extremely reasonable if you think 9 courses of food with 9 courses of wine, and it's it's not cheap, but it's good value. Mm-hmm. Which I think sort of our restaurant reflects as well. It's not a cheap night out, but it's good value for what you get. In some lower end, I find that Europeans generally have a more reserved, that North America is better at hospitality kind of writ large in terms of the customer's always right and people being very nice, and maybe that's because North Americans work for tips and Europeans don't necessarily work for tips. But in the places I was eating, most of the time, the level of service was so elevated that it was always great. But in local bars or cafes or something like that, it's sort of like, I know you think I'm American, but I exist. Can you come over and talk to me, please? Because
they're getting paid either way.
Yeah, they're getting paid either way. They're getting paid like doctors over there. But you can just show them like your Canadian badge. You're like, please talk to me.
Yeah.
I just want a beer. I'm sorry. Yeah. But
so I guess all around it was pretty high quality. I mean, were they more or higher quality than what you're used to?
I wasn't spent some time in Iceland, and the wine in Iceland is terrible. I went to a wine bar, so a place that is designed and promoted as a wine bar, and I think they had 6 wines, the entire place. And
at a wine bar.
At a wine bar, and I asked for one, and the lady offered. She goes, "Oh well, it's our happy hour right now, so it's two glasses for the price of one of our house wine." And I said, "What's your house wine?" And she kind of paused. She goes, "It's Italian." And that was it. And I said, you know what? I think I'm not going to have that. And I pointed at something, the only one I recognized, and it was terrible. And it cost me about $17 a glass or something like that. But Iceland is not necessarily known for their wine. Mm-hmm. Iceland, beer was illegal in Iceland until 1989. Isn't that crazy? And apparently now that it's legal, it is huge in Iceland. People are really, really into beer in a very big way, but not so much into wine now.
So I guess, that's why
their
wines on the level of food, would you say it's kind of on par, better? We're maybe not there yet where they are, or is it kind of all comparable?
Iceland or Europe? Iceland, we're there. Iceland, we're past. Yeah. Europe, no. Europe is definitely the leading. Europe and the States are definitely. I guess the rest of the world. Canada is definitely not where the rest of the world is in terms of food. There are a few examples of Ontario cooking that I think are international level cooking, but when you think of those places in London or Copenhagen or Tokyo or Sydney or New York, no, Canada's not there yet. It will get there eventually. It will get there, but just like our wine, we do really good stuff, but we're not there yet.
I guess that might come too with presence, and as it gets better, you'll get better chefs. You'll get more exposure, bring more people, kind of bring more talent, perhaps.
Toronto had a weird thing where kind of you had that Sousa Lee generation of really extreme fine dining, and that was sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, and then all the cooks who worked at those places didn't have any money, so they started these really, really small places with shoestring budgets, cooking really good food, very, very cheap. And everyone sort of went down market, where now it's like everyone goes to taco places, and everyone goes to poutine places, and everyone goes to these sort of nose-to-tail burger places. And that sort of old school fine dining kind of got left in the dust. And so it's pretty rare to find places that are doing really, really ambitious things anymore, just because to do so you generally need a huge backer, or you need a lot of money to do it.
Yeah. And that whole idea of classic too, in that white tablecloth, you've got to be very well dressed, and I'm sure they still exist, but a lot of these places you're talking about, I imagine you can go in wearing clear plastic sandals and a V-neck t-shirt.
I mean, a while back, it was Rene Redzepi, the cook, the chef from Noma, tweeted that something like 70% of our patrons tonight are in t-shirts, and those people are paying like that'd be $400-500 for their dinner that night. That's considered the world's best restaurant, and everyone's in t-shirts. That's just a change in culture across everything in terms of like taboos and movies and radio and all sorts of stuff. People are just more casual, and I don't think dress codes exist in restaurants anymore. There used to be like you had to wear a jacket. Now I can't imagine a restaurant that. I think Langdon Hall up in Muskoka, or wherever it is, one of the better restaurants in the world. It's part of a hotel and spa and stuff. I think they have a dress code still, but I'm not sure.
I think that's actually in Kitchener.
Is it?
Because it was mentioned.
Maybe.
It's not too far from.
I've never been. I always wanted to go. It's one of the nicer restaurants in Canada, but I think because of probably the clientele they're serving, I think it has a dress code. I read it on their website, but I've never been.
In the identity of kind of that type of restaurant, and even yours and the ones in Toronto or wherever, how well known is the chef? Is that, because you see on TV, you've got the chefs, they've got their own shows. Is it something that is advertised greatly?
It's. I think the cult of personality is a huge thing in cooking now, and it's about the chef as a brand. It probably wasn't always like that. I mean, historically, you did have those very famous chefs coming out of France and stuff, but somehow in the last 15 or 20 years, the chef himself became the star, and that was when it shifted away from the customer being the star and being served to like the chef being the star and people being lucky to eat at his restaurant.
Kind of like a celebrity.
Yeah, it's almost celebrity. And there's real celebrity chefs when you think of like Mario Batali or Ramsay and that kind of stuff. But then there's, at least in my industry, there's like there's celebrities in our industry, but not really outside of it. Like, have you eaten at his new restaurant? It's like everyone knows that chef. Now my mother in St. Catharines doesn't know him, but to us, he's like a celebrity or a big deal. But it's sort of forces. It's a narrative that's easy to speak to people, and if a chef has this sort of interesting narrative about or this interesting kind of gimmick or niche that he fits into, it's really, it can be like the sort of selling point.
Mm-hmm.
And like, oh, did you like, my first real job working in Toronto was at Marvin Restaurant when Carl Heinrich was cooking there, who then went on to win Top Chef Canada season 2, and then started Richmond Station, which is a kind of very successful restaurant in the core, very casual, like kind of nose to tail, farm to table, Canadian comfort food, I guess you'd call it.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of building a restaurant around a chef rather than a restaurant existing and chefs sort of being interchangeable.
Yeah, kind of in the background. You never see them.
Yeah.
And kind of that, and you see a lot of times now too, I'm sure it's not, everywhere where there's that open
kitchen, yeah.
Yeah, where the kitchen is almost part of the experience.
Yeah.
And I imagine that kind of came along with it, and maybe some food concerns or God knows what, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's the idea of a chef-driven restaurant versus like a restaurant, like the idea, it's different. Like there's, chefs used to be like someone owned a restaurant and then a chef would come work there, and then if a chef became big enough, he would go start his own restaurant, and maybe he cooked there, maybe he didn't, but then it became a restaurant and there was another chef underneath him and stuff, and now the places are so small and generally such shoestring budgets that the chef is the restaurant.
Yeah.
And you get these places like Chanticleer where it's like 20 seats, 25 seats, or something like that, and it's just you go there for the chef's food.
Oh, that few seats, I'm sure it's just nice to see a packed restaurant.
I mean, 25 seats, you get 10 people, it looks fine.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Huh. So how can people learn more about Actinolite? Where is it?
It's so Actinolite Restaurant is it's in Toronto. It's on Ossington Street, 971 Ossington, just north of Bloor, not in all the restaurants on Ossington. People think they would be north of Bloor on your way to DuPont. Actinoliterestaurant.com is the restaurant. Actinolite Food is the Twitter handle.
And that's controlled by you, so you have no idea or people won't have any idea what they're going to see.
Yeah, I'm not the only person who tweets, but I do have access. So you will occasionally find, if you see terrible grammar, it's chef. And then if you see a joke you don't really understand, it's probably me. And then if you see exclamation points, it's our social media expert. Yeah. So there's 3 different personalities working on it. I do the Instagram. So if you're on our Instagram, I think it's called Actinolite Restaurant. I don't know what it is. It's Actinolite something or other.
Well, I'm sure just that enough.
Yeah, I'm the one who takes all the pictures for that, and that's fun. I gave up posting my own Instagram photos. I just do it all on Actinolite now. But So Tuesdays to Saturdays, dinner service, closed Sunday, Monday.
And I got to ask too.
Regarding I'm the DJ as well. So
that's exactly what I was going to ask. Can you control the music?
Mm-hmm.
And what type of music should customers expect?
A really well curated list. I think it's about 15 hours long, actually, of music that I've curated myself.
That took 30 hours to put together.
I probably spent more time on the music than I have on anything else in that restaurant. And when I was being interviewed for the job, they're like, "Oh, we really want someone to redo the music," and I was like, "I'll work for free. Let me control it."
Done. I accept.
Yeah. Well, actually, we pretty shortly after our review, a woman named Ruth Reichel came in, who some people might know. She used to be the food critic for the New York Times, and she was the editor-in-chief for Gourmet magazine. She lived before my time. She's on the Food Network. She writes. She just wrote a book recently. She came in and sat at the bar, and and it's always nice when people compliment the food, but of course I didn't cook it, so what the fuck. But and then at the very end she goes, "Who did the music here?" And I was like, "Me." And she's like, "It is great." And I was like, "Thank you very much."
Wow. Do you remember what song was playing?
I forget. I think it was the Talking Heads or something. I have a lot of odds are it's Talking Heads. There's lots of Talking Heads on that.
Yeah. Right. So there's the secret right there, Talking Heads.
Honestly, if you ever come to a restaurant and compliment the music, you probably get something free. Generally, whenever I hear someone talking positively about Radiohead, I usually send them something.
Yeah.
But
Oh, well, there you go. That's how you can learn a bit more about the restaurant. We're out of time. So if you like the podcast, you can follow the Twitter at EYC There's also, that's actually spelled KAS, EYCKAS, that's me. You can also follow the Instagram, which is the same handle, EYCKAS. And otherwise on Facebook as well. There's the Elevate Your Craft page. It's all one word with a capital E. And look forward to seeing you next time, because this is the first of many. Thanks very much, Mr. Matthew Landry. I appreciate your presence here today. And we'll talk again soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
All
It was
right.
great.